All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video for our spotted lanternfly research project, and this is going to be understanding invasive species. Let's get started on this next video. So what is an invasive species? Well, an invasive species is a non-native species that spreads from the point of introduction and becomes very, very abundant. So let's think about invasive species. If we were to go to Florida, we're going to see lots of lionfish. Lionfish, stink bugs, you're probably familiar with these. Cane toads in Australia. Lanternflies. Invasive species are not originally from this area, and they're brought over in some way. And they're usually brought over by humans, and they cause havoc and destruction to ecosystems, economies, etc. So what we're going to go through and look at are zebra mussels. And these are small freshwater bivalves. They're shellfish that were brought to the US as stowaways in the ballast of ships. Now they originated in the Great Lakes, but we can actually see them spreading in some of the ecosystems in Pennsylvania. And we're going to go through and take a look at that now. Now they're particularly a pain because they can go through and wreck boats. You can see that this propeller is all destroyed here on that boat. And you can also see that they're going to go through and impact other organisms in that ecosystem. So we can see this crayfish is completely covered by these zebra mussels, and it's actually inhibiting that crayfish from going through and living. Now, when we think about the impact of invasive species, well, like our zebra mussels, they're going to have an impact on the area that they go through and we can say infect. So they certainly have an impact on the ecosystem. So this can be the marine waterways, but it's also going to be all those organisms in that ecosystem. But they also have an effect on the economy. All those boats that need to come in and ship material there, and all the local businesses that rely on those waterways are going to be impacted by these invasive species. So when we go through and think about this, invasive species have a large impact on the environment that they go through and they are introduced to. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive down into a Pennsylvania quarry, and we're going to see these invasive species and these zebra mussels firsthand. And we're going to see how they go through, and we're going to look at some structures that they go through and encrust themselves on. All right, so what we can see in this video here is we're going to take a dive down in a Pennsylvania quarry. And a quarry is just an area that has been mined and now has filled up with water. So they used to go through and mine it for rocks, and then over time it's filled up with groundwater. So what we're going to do is there's a wrecked plane in this quarry in Pennsylvania, and we're going to see the impact that it has on that ecosystem. So if any of you guys are familiar with scuba diving, what we've gone through is we've dropped down a little line here to our wrecked plane. And this is about 35, maybe 40 feet deep as we go through. And this is me and my brother here going through and diving down to this plane. Now, as we go through and approach that plane, what we see is all this hair algae going through and growing on the wings of that plane. And we can see as we go through, and as I go through and put my hand down on this plane, you can see all of that green hair algae. Now, as we go through, you can see this quarry here is significantly deep, and you can see that here's the line that's been tied off. And as we go through and look at this plane, we're going to go through and look under the wing and see all of these different creatures that are going through and encrusting themselves. If we look in the distance, we can actually see some of the zebra mussels going through and encrusting. On the very bottom edge of this plane, what we can see, and if we go back, underneath that wing, we can see all these zebra mussels encrusting themselves on this rock here and underneath that wing. Now, as we move closer to the engine compartment of this plane, again, we have that green hair algae. It's at the top of the plane for the sunlight, but then we see all these zebra mussels in the front engine compartment of that plane. Now, the hair algae is going to go towards the top of the plane because it needs that sunlight from the surface of the water. But we can see underneath some of the ledges of these rocks and underneath some of the ledges of this plane, we can see all of those zebra mussels going through, encrusting themselves and sticking themselves to that plane. So if we zoom in on that engine just a little bit more, we're going to be able to see some of those mussels that are going through and growing on there. We can see them there on the right hand side of that screen. And again, you can see how the mussels are going through and fighting and competing for space with that green hair algae. You can see them encrusting anywhere that is not the surface of the plane. Now, if we look at this second video, this is going to be a little bit deeper dive, but we're going to see all these zebra mussels pretty deep down. What we're doing is I'm diving about 60, maybe I think it was 60 to 70 feet here. And this plane here, this is a Learjet that's actually suspended. So this is not actually a wreck plane. They sunk this plane on purpose. So you can see as we go through and approach that plane, we have all that hair algae growing at the top of the plane because that's trying to get all the sunlight from the surface. But as we go through and move deeper and deeper, and we can see the water's actually getting a little bit murkier, you actually feel how much it'll get much colder the deeper down you go. We can see all these mussels going through and encrusting themselves on that plane. So I'm going to try to go through and sweep by this wing real quick. I don't want to go too deep because I'm trying to go through and make sure I don't sink below the plane and go too deep. But what I want to do is you can actually see as I get really, really close up, we can see all the different things on this plane wing, and we can see all the mussels growing on the bottom. We can see all the mussels actually growing along the wheels of this plane, all these mussels growing along the whole bottom edge of that plane. Now, as I go through and approach one of the compartments to go in the plane, what you can see is, again, we see all the mussels moving along the bottom there. And as we go through and swim into that compartment there, we can see, again, all the different life that's going through and growing on that plane. So what we can see here is we're moving into that compartment, and we can see now we're inside the plane, and the cockpit is up that way. We can actually see this little bass come swim out in between both of us here. And as we move from the back compartment into that front compartment of the plane, we can see all of these little sunnies and all these little fish that are actually hiding in here. They've gone through and they've spawned, and they're creating a little hiding spot for them to go through and live in. Now, just so you guys can go through and see, if we move forward in that plane, again, you can see all these little fish here, but you can see there's actually the controls left in the plane, the throttle controls and the stick controls here. You can almost look out of that plane as if it was flying in the air. Again, look at all the mussels that are going through and encrusting themselves on the structure of this plane. So you can see that these mussels go through and they can take over these large areas and these large structures that are underwater. And you can see how they can wreak havoc on boat engines, hydroelectric dams, all of the different waterways that depend upon boat traffic and movement to move through there. And they also have an impact on the ecosystem, all the other organisms that live in there.